Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Revenant. Emmanuel Lubezki is probably one of the greatest cinematographers living today, and he's always mentioned among the best, probably up there with Roger Deakins. And I will probably always see a movie that's shot by Emmanuel Lubezki. While watching this movie, I was often taken aback by how beautiful and amazing his cinematography was, and how great and wonderful the natural light he used in it was. But it was often that most of the shots didn't feel like they had as much of a point as they really should have in a story. And that's kind of the biggest problem with The Revenant, is that it's a pretty simple story, and it felt like any time I would start to get into the story, Aritu or Lubezki's cinematography would take away from that story. And it's kind of sad because I think this could be a pretty cool movie if a lot of that was cut out of it. But then even when he's doing like weird metaphorical stuff, it's so on the nose and clear, it's kind of embarrassing and stupid. Everything that I've ever heard negative about Iñárritu lately, that he makes art movies for normal people and not as deep as he thinks he is, I saw come to fruition when I saw The Revenant. And I was kind of surprised and very disappointed by this movie. It's not a movie that I hate and I think is a bad movie. There are parts that I'd get really into it and I'd be in awe by, and parts I'll always remember the shots from and just how stunning it was. But then as a whole, there's so many things that took away from that experience because of directorial or artistic ego that kind of just messed with this movie from being more of a story-focused film, when it's clearly the story that this film is based on needs to be the center of it, not, wow, look at how amazing this movie is. It should have been more interested in wowing me with the story and the characters, and it wasn't. It was more interested in wowing me with the direction and the cinematography and DiCaprio being in dirt and shit. I wish it had maybe cared a lot more about the story, because then I would have left thinking about the story of the film and less about, wow, that was really beautiful. But I don't know if oftentimes a lot of that beauty means as much as I think they think it does. There's a lot of stuff that felt more like stuff that would be cool on Lubezki's Instagram page, which I do follow his Instagram, but don't have the weight and the context that someone like Deakins always brings to his cinematography, and usually Lubezki does. There's no real reason he shot this film the way he did, whereas Birdman, the way it was shot makes sense for the way it's telling its story, with all those things happening backstage, with all this propulsive action. It fits the mood of the film. And this, it felt like it was just like a Lubezki wanted to shoot this the best way he could, but did that fit this film? Did the way they were shooting it with natural light at kind of magic hour scenarios and certain lighting situations, was there a reason for it? And it's almost like a style version of what Terrence Malick does, who Lubezki has worked with. Lubezki is Terrence Malick's cinematographer for the most part, but it didn't seem to understand the deep, rich visual narratives that Terrence Malick can bring. It kind of just brought a very simple but artistically pretentious vision that ended up not being as interesting as I think the filmmakers wished it was. Hugh Glass, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and his team of fur trappers, they have a big group of people, but then they are all attacked by Native Americans, and most of their team is killed, and they have to try to survive in the wilderness, and they are surviving with Tom Hardy, John Fitzgerald, Donnell Gleeson playing Captain Henry, and DiCaprio's son Hawk, and they're going through the woods and trying to survive and think they can get out of it until Hugh Glass is attacked by a bear and mangled and very injured, and they're carrying him along, and they realize it's too tough and leave people behind, including Tom Hardy's John Fitzgerald, who decides to leave him for dead and bury him in the dirt. But he's not dead, even though they knew he wasn't dead. They just kind of leave him there because they want to move on. Or Fitzgerald wants to leave on, even though the guy with him does not. And Hugh Glass moves on to hopefully get back to civilization and get his revenge on John Fitzgerald. The opening scene really just throws you in it. This attack from the Native Americans that happens early on in the film happens right away. The beginning sequence almost structurally feels like the beginning of an action movie. If you saw Mission Impossible Rogue Nation and the beginning part where Tom Cruise is hanging off of a plane, that's cool and fun and a little more honest to what that movie's doing. In The Revenant, they basically do that. It begins and feels very much like a big studio action film, which is odd because you're just like, I thought this was like this deep Oscar thing. But then it's a weird sequence because you don't really know who anyone is. Notice how I brought up a sequel movie when I compared it to this. Any sequel to an action movie can have a sequence like that because you know the character. Presumably, if you're seeing Lethal Weapon 2, you saw Lethal Weapon 1. And if you saw Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, you probably have seen other ones and you know who Tom Cruise is and Simon Pegg is and so forth. In The Revenant, you get there and you're like, well, I get who DiCaprio's Hugh Glass is somewhat, not really, but everyone else is kind of a mystery and you're just meeting minutes before. You don't get any definition behind their character. So caring about and wondering who's going to live and who's going to die kind of just leads to, wait, so who's famous and who have I seen in a movie before? And that seemed to be the only way I could tell. That didn't really work for the narrative. It felt very empty for an amazing, crazy sequence. It sets you in this weird mode where it really feels testosterone-y and action-y. Like it wants to do Walter Hill or Carpenter or something like that, but it doesn't really get like the things they're referencing. It's just doing it in a very shallow kind of way. So all you're really getting from that is the propulsion and the wowness, and like that Fitzgerald and Hugh Glass don't really like each other and things like that. It takes a while to understand the characters. It's like the film's main focus early on is wowing you. It's not early on getting you to know this guy that you're going to be stuck climb through the dirt. And that's probably the focus of a film if a film's mainly about someone, for the audience to kind of get to know them. And it takes a while to do that because its main focus isn't that. And I think that's Iritu's biggest problem in this is, again, the thing that everyone says, he has this massive ego as a director, and you can see that through his directorial voice. And I could really see that through this. This really feels like a director showing off. Even the cinematography is like wowing you, but in a very like knowing way. Its main focus is like how showy it is. And this is a very showy kind of Oscar-y type of movie, but its main focus is being showy. And that's not good for meaning anything to an audience. You're just more kind of there to be wowed, to take in all this glory and this beauty and this quote-unquote art, but you're not going to fall in love with this movie. I would have a hard time falling in love with this movie. And because that seems to be the main focus, and it seems the story is almost second to that, it's just disappointing that like Iñárritu's not as interested in being a storyteller or saying anything with the movie. He's almost more interested in wowing you with Lubetzky's cinematography. And there was one sequence in this film where there's two characters talking to one another, and one guy's here and the other guy's over here, and the camera pans, and when the camera's panning, we're just seeing this mountain. And I was like, why are we watching this mountain right now? Like, what's the purpose of this shot? And there was no purpose. There were often times where they'd cut to things and they'd look very beautiful, very stunning, very amazing, but they had no context in it. The craft of this movie is awe-inspiring and amazing, but the artistic intent or the meaning of it is just not there. It's very technically gifted. It's like a really smart film student had way too much money on their hands. You're showing off what you can do. Lubetzky showed off probably more of what he can do more than anyone, and he used a lot of his Terrence Malick style. I've never seen him use the kind of stuff he usually does for Terrence Malick in another director's movie before as much as he did in this film. It's amazing. Like, usually his best work is for Terrence Malick. A lot of this kind of using natural light, clearly it's trying to harken to Days of Heaven, but the idea of Days of Heaven was actually because it's from a child's perspective, so there was an actual reason to shoot it that way. It wasn't just shot that way because Terrence Malick has a huge ego. There was a reason for it, and it looks beautiful and it ties the movie together because it works so well. There's a reason people will always talk about Days of Heaven, but then you look at The Revenant and you're like, well, why was this? There's no reason. It's just Lubetzky being Lubetzky. There's sometimes you can be showy, like Roger Deakins did with Skyfall, but it works for Skyfall and gives a mood to it. And there is a certain mood to this film, but a lot of it is just how grimy and dirty and terrible the Old West was. That feels really repetitive. It did feel like this film was repetitive, bringing up points we've already seen cinematically if you've seen enough movies, but it also kept repeating those over and over again. And even using the wildernesses to show the emotions of it is something Anthony Mann did. He was kind of a precursor actually to what happened with spaghetti westerns. He's kind of like, in westerns it was like him and then spaghetti westerns. And what Mann did much better with that is Mann was being moody. And you can't really be moody when you're like, I don't know, surviving. He didn't really understand how he was using these storytelling tools. Almost he was just like kind of using them and hoping they would work. It was just a failure of storytelling, but I don't think it was, well, it's not a failure of storytelling because he wasn't thinking of storytelling. storytelling. He was thinking of wowing you. And the metaphors in this, like, there's one part where he's losing faith and he has a dream about being in a broken church. It was just so blatant sometimes, and all the stuff with his dead wife didn't really need to be in there. He would bring up points that, like, maybe should have just been on the cutting room floor. This felt like a director's cut and not a release cut. Sometimes they would just hold on shots for far too long, and then I'm like, why are we doing this? It's not that I'm against art film or artier cinematography. I actually quite like that kind of stuff, but there has to be some reason to it. But you could tell that there wasn't anything behind it, so you're like, why are we waiting so long to constantly repeat this? Like, it was hard, it was terrible, but it's like, dude, I get it, like, just let it go. It was everything I hate about pretentious direction and auteur theory and letting the director do whatever they want, is like they make crap like this and you're just like, ugh, okay, guess you're a great director. I like DiCaprio in this. I don't think it's like this amazing defining performance. I think the problem probably with it is that it calls to mind how much he did for the role, and obviously when people do that, they're mainly talking about De Niro in Raging Bull. And I think the thing about De Niro in Raging Bull is, although he gained a lot of weight, he was an amazing actor and there's an amazing performance there, and it was more than just, hey, he gained a lot of weight and built all this muscle and he did all these things to himself physically. And DiCaprio in this film almost feels like he's bringing too much attention to all the crazy shit he had to do in it, and it wasn't as much about the amazingness of what he's doing with this character. He still did an amazing job and he's an amazing actor. This film didn't need to cement that. It had been cemented years and years before. I also like performances from people like Will Poulter and Domhnall Gleeson, and didn't even notice Lucas Haas in this. Apparently he was in this. I missed him, I guess. I thought Tom Hardy was really, really good in this film, and I don't think, probably one of the reasons Tom Hardy was good in this film, he really makes a really evil son of a bitch in this movie, and the way he played it, where you really knew that character and you knew he was a son of a bitch throughout the whole thing, and Tom Hardy plays that so well that when he moves his eyes, you know exactly what he's thinking. It was a really great performance, and I don't love every Tom Hardy performance, but I think this was probably one of his better ones I've ever seen him do. He's just such a good villain. I really wish he'd played more villains, to be honest, after this. The other things with this film is that it starts as a testosterone-y action thing, becomes a survival thing, then becomes a revenge movie. If it's gonna be all these different things, I wish it had connected those better. But ultimately, I think the problem with this movie is that it's an art movie for anyone to understand. I like it when everyone gets a movie. I like it when the whole audience feels a movie. But mixing art movie with mainstream fare is usually a way to make a really terrible movie and a really pretentious film. And I think this film is probably one of the worst at that. It's too easy to get. There's not as much behind it as there really should be for all this, you know, big motion picture, everyone sacrificed kind of shit that's going on throughout this film. There should have been more to it, and there isn't. And when you're sitting there and you're waiting for this thing that's supposed to blow your mind, and it disappoints because maybe your expectations are too high, but also disappoints because there isn't anything there, because even if you saw this and didn't have expectations, you go, I mean, it's really pretty, and that's kind of what you'll take away from it, is like the acting was good, it was very gorgeous, but it's not a very well directed and managed film. It is like the reverse of economical storytelling, because it's just so much in there that just should be done away with. I think Iñárritu is full of hype and hot air, just too into his own movie and not into it on a storytelling level. He needs to understand how to tell a good story, and almost like how to tell a simple Western. This is very much bloated filmmaking at its most bloated. I didn't like hate this movie. There are parts I really liked, there's parts I was blown away by, but overall when you look at it, you're like, I mean, why is this an important movie? And I can't really back that up, other than that this movie thinks it's important. And instead of being important, it just reeks of pretension. It reeks of a director who cares too much about his own ego and too much about a movie wowing you, but not doing it in that surface level fun way, just doing it in a way that I'm supposed to be wowed technically by this film. And technically, I guess I was. But in terms of a full package of a movie, of story and character, I think as a director, he completely let me down in a lot of ways. Telling a solid story and having a real connection with the audience, this film didn't really have, because the remove for it was showing off how amazing this movie was. And this movie was just too concerned with that. Its concern, in a way, should either gone full art movie or story, and it just kind of did both and didn't do either very well. And so you get stuck with kind of a very messy movie that liked to show how messy and tough the world was, and ended up being a tough movie to get through, not because it was so dense and had all these complex ideas, but because you couldn't believe it just kept repeating the same thing. This is technique and craft and artistic ego gone awry. He made just kind of a big, important movie that demanded to be taken seriously and to be considered important, but in the end it wasn't, because it needed to be vulnerable, it needed to be honest, it was too guarded in its own pretentious artistry, ended up being more of a lie of a great movie than a real great movie. And I think most people would much rather see a good movie than a movie pretending to be a great artistic cinematic experience. So if you have seen The Revenant and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.